Andrew,
John.
good to see you. It's been an interesting last few months, isn't it?
Well, it's been an interesting last few years, but it has hotted up the last few months.
Yeah.
I think since I gave that speech in the chamber on the 13th of December, I think things have moved along a bit with regard to the issue of vaccine harms and vaccine damage and the efficacy and safety, and also with regard to my position in Parliament. I mean, I think the two issues are inexorably linked.
And I was going to say, can we go into that story? So we've got a kind of a big American following. They might not have been aware of the story in yourself. Is it okay if you could just lay out your backstory a little bit and also what led to the controversy?
My current position, yes, if we go back, I've got a qualification a long time ago, Nottingham University. I studied biological sciences. I've got an upper second in biological sciences. I specialised in biochemistry in the first year, genetics, behaviour, and my dissertation in my final year was actually on viruses and viroids. So I have some background knowledge, and I've always stayed interested in that subject. And so clearly when scientists and doctors explain to me their views on vaccines, the whole pandemic response strategy, I'm very interested. I was deeply uncomfortable about the lockdowns. I was assured by the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson that a full impact assessment had been carried out of the wider harms to society, in particular children and their education. As it turns out, the then Prime Minister may have misled me, and there wasn't actually an impact assessment. So I voted for the second lockdown. I voted against the rest, and my concerns grew because it didn't seem to me that we were going with the science. Natural immunity is far better than any vaccine. The science I've seen is between 3.5 and 20 times better. No account was ever made of people who'd actually had COVID. They wouldn't need any vaccines. And that concern grew to probably a year last December when the government brought forward the Plan B response and were indicating that they were looking to lock the country down for a second Christmas. I studied all the papers coming out of South Africa with regard to the Omicron variant. It was clear that it had attenuated from the original Wuhan strain. It was much milder, more transmissive, which is the normal way that viruses evolve over time. They generally evolve to become less pathogenic, less dangerous, but they want to, but more transmissible. So the original Wuhan strain probably had an R figure of 4, and Omicron variant had probably got an R figure of 12 or 14, the R figure being the number of people that one infected person is likely to infect. So with the original strain, it was 4 people, and with Omicron it was probably 12. Clearly, whatever measures were taken at that level of transmissibility, it was going to be ineffective. But also, because it had attenuated, was much milder, the number of people hospitalised was going to be a lot less. And in the debate a year last December, I spoke in that debate. I also raised concerns around the messaging by the government throughout the pandemic, and I finished that speech off by saying, it's on Hansard, that the only pandemic we've really been suffering is a pandemic of fear, and that's got to stop, because clearly it was induced by government announcements. And since then, I voted against Plan B. I voted against the masks. I voted against the mandates for NHS staff, which were completely wrong. And obviously, since then, I think everything I said in that debate's been vindicated. We now find admission from Pfizer. We know from experience that taking the vaccine neither prevents you contracting COVID-19 or transmitting it. The mandates were effectively wrong and illegal, in my view, and could be subject to litigation by people who may have lost their jobs or have been handicapped in their promotion by their view on bodily autonomy, which is a human right under the Nuremberg Code. And, since then I've met lots of scientists who've given me their views on the harms. I've studied the Pfizer documents that were released under duress. The original trial data that Pfizer wanted to keep hidden for 75 years, but the US Supreme Court forced them to be released. I mean, there's 50,000 pages. I've looked at the summaries, and there's no way, in my view, that if those had been made public, those vaccines should never have been authorised. The minimum is 1 in 800 people who take the mRNA vaccine will have a serious harm. It's probably considerably more than that, John, because Pfizer only followed post-vaccination for 8 weeks. So anyone who had a severe adverse event after 8 weeks relating to the vaccine, they will not have been picked up in the trial. So it's a minimum of 1 in 800. And I've spoken to cameramen. I've been interviewed quite a few times in my political career, and I've got a pretty good relationship with all the cameramen for the BBC, ITV, and etc., who come and interview me. And they've come forward to me and said that during the lockdowns they went to Number 10 to film these momentous announcements by the government when they're at the podiums, telling us the death rates and how we've all got to give up our freedoms. And he said very, very severe. So normally they would take a team of 3 in, a sound man and somebody to coordinate, the cameraman. They were saying only one person allowed in, so the cameraman was having to do everything. He'd got to be fully vaccinated and tested and everything, and masked. And he said, and when he got in there and set all up, and he was filming, obviously live, it was going out to the nation, he said if he'd swung the camera 180 degrees, standing behind him were dozens and dozens of spads who'd got no masks and weren't socially distancing. And that all now stacks up with what came out over Partygate, that, clearly the people at Number 10, they knew all the science. And the fact is they weren't scared, were they? They weren't scared that not socially distancing, not wearing masks in Number 10 and having parties and all that, that wasn't going to kill their grandmother. But that was the message they were pumping out. And as a behavioural scientist, I quite liked the idea of having a nudge department in government, on the basis that the difference is, I would have said, the message on your tax return is, if you don't return this form on time, you'll get fined £200. A nicer message, a nudge, is 99% of people return this form.
But a shove is a different matter, right?
And what it was we weren't being nudged, we were being shoved. And we were shoved, we were coerced, and the damage, particularly to young people's mental health, I think is immeasurable. They don't necessarily have the life experience to realise that not everything you see on the television or reading the newspapers is actually the truth. And I've seen the impact. I think it was February 2020, I had more, obviously the police made me aware of the number of suicides in my constituency, which we were having more suicides in a month than I would have in 2 years. And I really wanted to do something about it, but I thought I was in sort of, if I say something about it, I was just worried there's going to be...
When was this, Andrew? What point?
February 2021 was absolutely terrible. We had more suicides in my constituency than 2 years.
Is that the moment that you had the kind of more of a...
I could see the impact it was having on my constituents. And for what? What were we actually achieving here? We know now that the average age of someone who died in the UK with COVID, or attributed to the COVID-19, was 82 and a bit, which is longer than normal longevity. These would be old people with an average of 5 comorbidities. And yet, we were initially told we were only going to vaccinate the vulnerable and we're going to look after and isolate the vulnerable. Then it was lockdown, universal lockdowns, universal vaccination. And we finally got round to this, to 2022, and my concerns now are very, very heightened. And I could have spoken out earlier, but it isn't always about speaking out, it's about speaking out and winning. On an issue you can win at. And if I am going to sacrifice my political career, I want to get something for it. And I realised that the issue was when the MHRA announced at the end of November, early December last year that they wanted to extend the vaccination to children under 5. I had seen papers from the American Journal of Medical Associations that 1 in 200 under 5s would probably be in hospital. So it's a lot of the evidence I've seen would suggest that the younger people are who have this experimental mRNA vaccine, we'll call it a vaccine, it's actually gene therapy, the more prone they are to adverse events, and potentially more severe those adverse events would be. And that's reflected also in the cardiology problems that, the figures coming out of America and various European countries, that the over 65s post-vaccination have a 10% increased chance of cardiac arrest, but for the 20 to 49-year-olds, it was a 30% increase. And can you imagine what that would be for babies down to 6 months of age? So when the MHRA announced that they were going to do that, then I was determined, and I put in for the speech I gave on the 13th for several weeks until I got that slot. And what I was determined was that we'd turn over the policy and protect those children and toddlers. And it's interesting that 6 weeks later, at the dispatch box, the vaccines minister had to release to the House or to the debate that the government had not decided whether to push the vaccine down to children, babies of 6 months of age, and that never happened in the end. What we actually had was an announcement at the end of January that the vaccine rollout is going to be limited from the 12th of February for over 50s and vulnerable groups. And then following that, the day after that, and even the morning after that announcement, data appeared on the government website, the UK Health Safety, which had been issued to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, the JCVI, on the 25th of October. And this data actually showed the efficacy of the boosters in detail, by age group and risk factor, how many boosters had to be given out to keep one person out of intensive care. And the schedule is there, and I could print it off, but from the top of my head, you're looking at figures: 40 to 49-year-olds who were healthy, which is most of them. It was something like about 935,000 people would have to be boosted with these experimental jabs to keep one person out of intensive care. Well, even on a cost benefit of the money, you're probably talking about £30 million to keep one person out of intensive care. If you look at the harm ratio, the risk benefit of the vaccine, the booster, 1 in 800 having a severe adverse event, which could be death. You were looking at 1,166 people hospitalised to keep one person out of intensive care. None of this adds up. In fact, when I analysed the figures, and these are the government's figures for the efficacy of the booster for keeping people out of hospital with COVID-19, the only group where it works, or who weren't disadvantaged, were the most vulnerable in society. So the over 70s, not healthy over 70s, but those with multiple comorbidities, so probably obese, probably diabetic, high blood pressure, all of those things. So that's the most at-risk group in our society. And for them, you had to boost 800 of them to keep one out of intensive care with COVID. But that's exactly the same risk of having the vaccine or the booster. And that's probably underestimated. I would have thought that even the most vulnerable group, if were they to feel that they were being exposed, could be exposed to COVID-19, curtailing their personal interactions for a few weeks while it's sweeping around would be a better protection for them than having an experimental booster, which is certainly going to give them at least a 1 in 800 chance of a severe adverse event. So from the government's own evidence, which only came out on their website on the 25th of January, no one should have had a booster. No one benefits from it except for Big Pharma. Indeed, most people have a huge disbenefit, and no one should be having one in the future. that's a speech I'm trying to give now. I put in for it this week, but mysteriously I didn't get an adjournment debate. We'll put in for it again after the February recess, and I'm hoping that that I get that on the record. And those are the government's own figures, and the data is, you can't argue with it. It's all there. No one should be having these boosters. No one's benefited from it, and lots of other anecdotal evidence has come to me. A lot of doctors, nurses have emailed me with their own experiences. Some very senior physicians in very big positions in major London trusts who will have to remain nameless, and they said in the autumn that the level of vaccine hesitancy amongst NHS staff was running over 65%. So 2/3 of NHS staff refused to take the booster in the autumn.
Firsthand,
these people should know.
Yeah.
Latest figures are that the rollout of the boosters, 96% of the appointments are unfilled. So they're only filling 4% of what they expected. People are voting with their feet, and it's quite right. For informed consent, people need to know the risks.
And we didn't have the informed consent. That's the thing.
We haven't had informed consent. We have not been made aware of the risks. We've got a government that indemnifies big pharma from the harms that their products do, and it would appear seek to silence members of parliament who wish to raise concerns about those harms. And I'll let your viewers come to their own views. And it isn't just in the UK, is it?
But why is it that you're the only one that sort of seems to have a bit of a spine and have the integrity to stand up and speak out? Do you think?
Well,
really?
I think we're supposed to be able to speak in the mother of all parliaments, and I'm honoured to represent North West Leicestershire. I've been an MP for nearly 13 years. We're supposed to speak in our parliament to represent the interests of our constituents and the public, wider public, without fear or favour. And what I will tell you, John, is there's no doubt in this mother of all parliaments now, there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of favour. What's been done to me over the last 12 months in the media is not only something to behold as far as it's to teach me a lesson, but it's also to teach other MPs what will follow if they challenge the narrative. Well, our job is to challenge the narrative, and I'm quite happy challenging the narrative because I know that the science that I'm basing my arguments on is 100% sound. And if anyone wants to, and what you've seen in the media is they don't challenge my arguments. They just try and play the man all the time and try and smear me in the media.
Yeah, they're playing the man, not the ball.
Yes, I'm now described as an anti-Semite racist.
So that you think that's to silence other people that want to speak out, right? They're using you as the scapegoat, as the fallback.
Well, they've suspended me from the party. I've lost the party whip for either anti-Semitism or my views on the vaccines. Well, my views on the vaccines, I don't remember in our manifesto in 2019 saying I had to fully endorse an experimental medical intervention which had not even been invented. If it is safe and effective, why do the pharmaceutical companies need an indemnity from prosecution?
Why did it need 75 years to be able to
well, they didn't get it, unfortunately.
Unfortunately,
and if you read, I tweeted out the summary. It's horrific. The harms are horrific, and there's now actually serious questions over manipulation of data and whether were people excluded. So it's okay running an experiment, but they never ever, big pharma companies never release the raw data from their trials because they say it's commercially sensitive. That could allow an unscrupulous company to conduct a trial where those who are worst affected by the trial are excluded from the final data, which is supplied to the regulators. What we also know is that the regulators are compromised. 86% of the MHRA's funding comes from big pharma. We've had disclosure from a widely publicised secret interview with a director of Pfizer that it's a revolving door between big pharma and the regulators, that people go and work, leave their company, go and work at the regulators for a few years, then come back to the pharmaceutical companies. Well, this is clearly unsatisfactory. What we're going to find out is that every protection for the public has failed them. So the regulators have failed. And I'll come back to that disclosure on the 25th of January of information that the regulator had as to the complete failure of the efficacy of the booster. They'd had that on the 25th of October. If they had that, why were the government still pushing at the end of November for the rollout to be extended to babies? This is
that was
madness.
a big wake-up call for a lot of people, that I have to say, for the children.
The reason I would stand on that issue is even someone who is the most pro-vaccine person you could get on, and these, bear in mind, they had to change the definition of vaccine to get these mRNA gene therapies included, and I don't think if they'd stood under their own banner, I'm not sure that the take-up would have been what it has been. They knew on the 25th of October, and they sat on that data for 3 months, and it's clearly there in black and white on the report that they've had that information for 3 months. We're in a position now where, say, it will only be over 50s, but I suspect that the public now are far more aware. I don't think there'll be very much take-up of these experimental treatments at all. In my view, they're not safe, they're not effective. They don't do what we were told they did. They don't stop infection. They don't stop transmission.
Yeah.
And the Omicron variant is, for the vast majority of people, no more than a cold. Why would we do this?
Can I ask then, what was convincing for you to get the jabs then? Because you said you had two AstraZeneca jabs.
I had two AstraZeneca.
So, given your background in virology and given the fact that there's this revolving door between big pharma
I didn't know that at the time. And bear in mind that Parliament wasn't working because we were locked down like everyone else. So I spent a long time locked down in my constituency. It's unsatisfactory.
But what was the motivation for you to get it, knowing what you know, and knowing how there's corruption, and knowing big pharma, the influence it has, and the revolving door with, the regulators and stuff?
I didn't realise that the level of the potential corruption that was in the system, and clearly meeting people and hearing about the harms.
Because you must have known that it didn't stop transmission or infection from the beginning, right?
No,
you didn't.
We didn't know that. No,
because I knew that after the first month or so.
Well, they were clearly telling us that take this and it's 100% effective.
97, and then it kind of slowly came down, didn't it? But that's all marketing, though, isn't it? The old 97%.
Well, I think Pfizer are the most fined pharmaceutical company in the world for making false claims about the efficacy of their products. Well, I mean, we've been lied to, and we've been lied to again, but they're not lying now. Well, I think they probably are. I mean, bear in mind, as Big Pharma have got a terrible reputation. Yeah. If we think back to the thalidomide scandal.
Exactly.
Horrendous.
Yeah.
And that took years to get to the point where people were paid the compensation they're due. And then I understand that the makers of thalidomide, despite knowing everything that it had done and the harms it had caused, changed the name and continued to sell it around the world for decades afterwards. And it's the same with the contaminated blood scandal. Yeah. That was, I understand, that was the contaminated blood that they hadn't sold, was then sent to India and sold cheap. Knowing, I mean, it's basically manslaughter.
Yeah, and we know vaccines take years to develop, and they've rushed this out.
Yes, I had a good meeting a couple of weeks ago with Mike Yeadon, who's the former head of research at Pfizer, till about eight or so years ago. He said it, in his view, his professional view, it's absolutely impossible to get a consistent vaccine produced in that time period, and that even the manufacturing process to get that there's a consistency, a homogeny across the vials would take years, and he thinks that there will be hot batches and less damaging batches. And I think, and now looking back, I mean, when you think that, you were classed as unvaccinated for 14 days after you had the jab, and then you look at the deaths in the few days after vaccination, and of course those were all classed as unvaccinated. But the reason, it's not a coincidence, I don't believe, that the people died within a few hours of having a vaccine. So they could all be dismissed. It's all been actually very clever, isn't it?
Well, they said within 28 days of having COVID, you go down as a COVID death. But then anything that happens with the jab, it's a correlation, not a causality.
They played it well, different rules, haven't they? Well, yeah, what were they saying? It might be a small number, but a small percentage of a large number is still a large number, except for when it comes to vaccine harms.
Yeah. And you were saying before, that a lot of people are getting this now, right? So a lot of other politicians, even people that you see in the building, and your cleaners and whoever it is, they're all aware of this now, right? Apart from the people at the top who seem to be brushing it under the carpet, don't know what's going on.
It's worse than that. I mean, for Chris Whitty to come out when I created some publicity around all of this and say that the reason we've got excess deaths now is because people didn't get their statins. As Esther McVeigh pointed out in the chamber last week, the data there and statin uptake has increased during the lockdown and since, so it's nothing to do with that. I mean, that's purely spurious, and that is misinformation. I mean, I can produce a video and it can be taken down off YouTube in a few hours for misinformation. Well, I can assure you, all the information I'm telling you now is all backed up by the science. When Chris Whitty goes out there and says it's probably because people haven't got enough statins.
Do they really say that? They really believe that?
Well, I don't know, but if you look at the science, the excess deaths is biggest in men aged between 20 and 49. They are not being prescribed statins. They're not going to their doctor every year for an ECG and a heart check. And we've even got increased mortality rates in the under 14s. They're certainly not been taken, wouldn't have been prescribed statins. And the reluctance to have an independent review. We've got, huge excess mortality, and anyone who thinks about it has would have concluded after a time of a pandemic where we've sadly had excess mortality, and you'd have thought the weak and the vulnerable will have succumbed to that virus, and sadly their lives have been shortened. Then you would normally expect a period of less than average mortality, because people who might have lasted another 12 months had already passed, sadly, due to the COVID pandemic. But that's not been the case. And as I pointed out to the vaccine minister again last week in a question, interestingly, on the ONS figures for mortality data sets, they were issuing mortality data sets by vaccine status until the 31st of May last year, when those data sets were not published anymore. And my question to the vaccine minister was very straightforward. I pointed out that's what had been happening until the 31st of May 2022, and could the minister confirm that her department do have the data regarding vaccine status of those who've deceased, and when will she publish it? And the minister's answer was that she'd write to me. Well, she hasn't written to me yet, and I'm not sure what she's going to write to me. I don't think it'll be a thank you card. So it's the answers coming from the government, but they wouldn't dissuade you from having what would be described as conspiracy theories.
So it still gets written off as conspiracy theory even now,
absolutely,
right?
Yep. I'm dismissed as having spreading vaccine disinformation. Even
though what you've been saying is just, for anyone watching, is like pretty much common sense.
The speech I gave on the 13th was not reported in the national media. The moment I sat down, a press briefing went out about that speech. I knew it was going to be controversial. It was backed up, I think, by 32, referenced all the facts I'd said, 32 scientific papers and journals to back up what I'd actually said in that 20-minute speech. Nobody in the mainstream media reported it, but as of last week, it had just passed 10 million views on social media. So considerable interest from the public.
Yeah.
But no interest from the mainstream media at all. The information that came out last week from the American actuaries who look at life insurance and life expectancy, and their job is to judge how long we're all going to live when they're offering life insurance policies. Otherwise, they lose their shirt, don't they? And they've cross-analysed data from the different states in the United States of mortality rates now and vaccine uptake, and they've come to the correlation line that the more vaccines you have, the more chance you have, or more boosters, the more chance of mortality. So they calculated out that for every vaccine you've had with the experimental mRNA, you're basically putting 7% on your chance of mortality. So, and they went into detail. They cross-referenced it with the UK figures.
Who did this? Sorry, who's doing this?
It was a team of actuaries and life insurance policies. I can let you have the reference, and it was all done. I mean, these people have to know the answers to these questions.
Yeah.
That's their industry. So a man over 50 who's had five vaccinations with the mRNA, with 3 boosters, is 35% more chance of mortality. Straightforward. I showed that to the mainstream media last week, the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Sky, and I said, look, I'll make myself available for an interview. This is really important. This is a clear statistical link between number of vaccines, excess mortality. And you can put whatever expert you're up against me and we can debate it. And I didn't have one offer from the mainstream media.
Are they starting to not have you on now because of this?
I've been on...
Who will have you?
GB News occasionally.
Yeah.
They get a bit nervous. Nobody. I've been once on the BBC following my suspension of the whip, and that's all they wanted to talk about. And when I talked about other things, off interview, they then called me a liar. Basically, recorded the interview with me, then talked about it in the studio when I wasn't there, basically saying that all my arguments have been debunked. That's not true. That is misinformation.
Yeah, that is.
And it's like living in a parallel universe,
We're in two different realities, basically.
We're in two different realities, and it's a bit like in Parliament now, where every day, 4 or 5, there are about 4,500 people work in Parliament, from cleaners and cooks and security guards to secretaries and clerks and lawyers. 4 or 5 of these people are coming to me every day and saying, thank you very much for everything you're doing and raising the awareness of all this. The staff here know what's going on, but the people with the power to actually do something about it, my colleagues in the House, they appear not to know what's going on.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, it's upside down and inside out, isn't it? I come back to the fear and favour.
What is that fear, though? Fear of what?
Well, I talked in my speech on the 13th about willful blindness or cognitive dissonance. The implication of what the facts are showing you takes a bit of getting your head round, and some people would rather not go there.
Yeah, but is it that, or is it the fact they're trying to protect their reputation?
Well, reputational damage.
Yeah.
They'll have seen how I've spoken out, and I continue to speak out, and the brickbats that have been thrown at me, and they probably don't fancy it.
Yeah, I see.
But we're talking about people's lives, and the issue of the small children. I think, if 1 in 200 6 months to 4 to 5-year-olds had ended up in hospital, and I have any ability at all to stop that, I'm going to do it.
Good man.
So, last weekend I'm in my constituency. Again, it's a parallel universe, because my constituents seem very, very comfortable with my position on this. The party are very uncomfortable about, Parliament's very uncomfortable about my position on this, but the public, my constituents, seem very comfortable. I went to a jobs fair at East Midlands Airport. My constituency is doing very well. We've got about the highest economic growth in the UK.
Leicestershire, right?
Northwest Leicestershire.
Northwest Leicestershire.
A fraction of UK average unemployment. One of the happiest places to live in the country. It was Labour until I took it in 2010. At the last election, I had nearly 2/3 of all the votes were for me, despite 6 candidates being on the ballot paper. The public seem to, and the emails we get, it's 99% supportive. So I don't understand why colleagues are thinking that if they came out and raised concerns that, and whether I'm right or wrong, in that chamber, if my constituents have got concerns, if one of them has got a concern and I raise it, that's perfectly legitimate. But it would appear it's not now.
You should be able to talk about everything apart from this.
And also, science works by challenge. Very few things in science are fixed forever. And you have a hypothesis. I'll test it by arguing with you. And I might come up with I say my hypothesis is better than yours, and very few things in science are fixed. A new idea comes that will supersede it, or modify it, or indeed debunk it. And we'll have we've just found out probably in the last few months that all these antidepressive tablets that people have been prescribed for decades and decades, they actually don't work, because the way of depression works, or that treatment works, is not the way that it was thought to have worked anyway. So all that money that has been spent and prescribing for decades of antidepressants has probably been completely useless. So things are wrong and have to be put right. Well, what we do know about the efficacy and safety of these experimental vaccines, treatments that weren't even available 3 years ago, no one's been allowed to raise questions. That's not a scientific method of analysis. No one's allowed to challenge the narrative, and that's anti-scientific.
Of course it is.
And
then you try and post something online. Big tech will shut that down, ban you, demonetize you, character assassinate you. I'm sure you're aware of all that as well.
Full fact, or some sort of self-appointed fact checker.
Yeah, who's fact checking the fact checkers here?
Well, I checked their funding out, and 75% of their funding comes from Facebook, so we know where that's coming from.
And other billionaire philanthropists as well.
Absolutely, without any vested interest in big pharma. So the whole thing stinks.
Who else is on your side?
I can't name names.
But are there? How many do you think there are?
A handful.
A handful.
There's a handful, and some, and obviously, the public flogging that I've had, lost the whip. The press attacking me repeatedly. That's dissuaded some colleagues from being willing to put their head over the parapet, which was clearly the intention of those who set out on that strategy.
Have you had an apology from Matt Hancock or not?
No, and I'm not expecting one. I think he'll just drag it out. I can't talk about it too much because the lawyers get very twitchy if I start talking about it. But I mean, we're determined to pursue that. But clearly, there's an angle there that were I to be successful in that action, that would then cast considerable doubt on the party's grounds for suspending me from the party, wouldn't it? It's wider implications than all of that. But it is a parallel universe where it would appear, I think most of the people in the country now have got we're seeing that by the booster uptake, aren't we? If people aren't taking it, people don't want their children to have it.
We can see even just like with the masks, people are just not wearing the masks anymore.
The masks never worked anyway. No. I mean, I was very critical of the masks and spoke out about that while the mandates were on. The paper masks are designed to stop saliva from the doctor getting into a wound on the patient or spittle, and it's to stop fluids from the patient, such as blood or other bodily fluids, getting into the mouth of the doctor, which you wouldn't really like. They're not. The holes in those masks are 800 times bigger than the virus. It would be like trying to stop a mosquito with a picket fence. And indeed, we uncovered some papers from Australia 20 years ago, during the SARS outbreak, where certain retailers in Australia were claiming that these paper masks would protect you from SARS, which is the same virus family, and the Australian government then threatened them with fines of up to $110,000 for making false claims about the efficacy of paper masks. And 20 years later, the Australian government's mandating people to wear masks which they know don't work.
But it did inculcate a state of fear amongst people.
That was what it was all about.
It was a visual thing, a visual clue to remind people that there was something going on, an evil danger.
And again,
you did behavioural science, right?
Yes.
This is part of that.
And I spoke about that, and the damage we've done is mostly to the vulnerable and our children. They can't pick up on facial cues which you need if people's faces are covered. So people's language skills will be behind. And sadly, they've terrorised unnecessarily some very vulnerable people in our society who are probably going to wear masks for the rest of their lives because of this. And I think that's really sad. I mean, basically unforgivable.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there any final message just to say for people moving forward from this? What can we learn? What can we take from this? What can we learn from this that this doesn't happen again? History doesn't repeat itself.
Well, to deal with it, first of all, dealing with the harms, which I don't believe are rare. I think they're common. And I think that's why the NHS is in a mess now, because we're dealing with all the side effects from the vaccination programme and the booster programme. I also think I've put in written questions asking by month for the applications to personal independent payments. I think in this country and across the world, where the vaccine was rolled out, I think we'll see a huge increase in people who have had to stop working because of disabilities. They've got to be looked after. Those who've been vaccine bereaved will have to be looked after. We're going to have to go after big pharma. This can never be allowed to happen again. But we can only start doing all of that. The first step to sorting out a problem is admitting we've got a problem, and I can't get my own parliament and my own government to admit we've got a problem. That's going to take the people, and I really want the people around the world who are concerned about this, who've got relatives who've suffered harms themselves, or who've got relatives or friends who've been harmed, they must write to their elected representatives. This issue has got to come forward. If we're going to sort it, we've got to admit we've got a problem. We haven't got a government around the world that will admit we've got a problem yet, but I can assure you we have.
We have, yeah. Just finally, what are your thoughts on Keir Starmer saying that he puts more faith into the World Economic Forum than he does into Westminster?
Well, I was horrified by that. I mean, that man, from his own lips, he's damned, and he should never be allowed to be Prime Minister. It's not safe. He's neither safe nor effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about the digital, the merger with the NHS and NHS Digital? Do you think that's part of this, and where's that going?
Well, I think the public have got to ask. I mean, they've had a lot of freedoms taken away from them, and I was shocked. I did say in the media while this was going on, I was shocked that the British people gave up freedoms so easily, under coercion, clearly, but freedoms that had taken hundreds of years to obtain, and we need them all back. And I can only see legislation coming through that's going to further erode personal freedoms. It's the antithesis of being a conservative. And I think we're going to have to resist. And the fact that the World Health Organization, who handled the pandemic so badly, and can clearly be influenced by money, the Chinese government basically bought them, and they were putting false information out even as late as January 20, when they were saying there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission of the virus, which was clearly spurious. That they want to extend their powers over sovereign parliaments, that they will handle the next pandemic, and they'll tell you when you've got to have a lockdown, and they'll make vaccines mandatory. Well, these things quite honestly horrify me, and they should horrify anyone who believes in democracy, accountability. Well,
you had Ted Ross, the Director General of the World World Health Organization.
Who voted for any of these? There's no accountability.
He was a former board member of Gavi, which is Bill Gates' vaccine program.
They're all in each other's pockets, and none of this is for the benefit of my constituents overall, or the people in this country or other countries. So we're going to have to make a stand, and this is the most important issue. We're going to decide what sort of society, what sort of country we want to live in, and what one we want our children and grandchildren to inherit. And the way it's going, it's not what I want, and I don't think it's what many people want in this country. But it would appear that certain people think that that's what we're going to be given. Well, I can assure you that I work for my constituents. They do not. I'm not their master. I'm their servant. And
we need to remind people of that, I think.
Well, I think some of my colleagues have forgotten that we serve the people. We're not their masters.
So people should write to their MPs,
and they should demand surgery meetings, and they should hold their elected officials to account across the world for their actions and inactions, and get some movement on this. I don't like the quote from, I think it was an American chappie, I can't remember his name. He said that when the people are scared of the politicians, that's tyranny. And when the politicians are scared of the people, that's democracy, and that's what we need now.
Andrew, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.